Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we're going to be going through the different jury scenarios that could happen on Survivor SA Return of the Outcasts. Now, this is something that I've done for other Survivor seasons I covered on this channel, usually in the last week before the finale. But basically, I like to take the players still in the game and rank the different final two combinations based on how likely it is that it'll happen, and then go through who I think would win in each of those scenarios. So it's always a fun little exercise for me to do. Now, with the other seasons that I've done this exercise for, I've done them for final three combinations, as I assumed that those seasons would end with final threes, and sure enough, that's what ended up happening here. However, for this season, I feel like it's going to end with a final two based on the episode count, and also based on what Survivor SA's generally done on most of its seasons. So I'll be running through final two combinations instead of final three combinations. Now, as of this recording, there are 5 players left in the game, those being Dino, Killarney, Marion, Phil, and Shane, meaning there are 10 possible final two scenarios, which is funny as that's the same number of final three combinations you can make. It's sort of funny how math works there. So, as I've done in the past with this exercise, I'll be ranking each of these final twos based on how likely I think they are to happen, based on the current game position of these players, and what the edit has been telling us up to this point, and who I think will win the game. But let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final two I believe is the least likely to happen, based on everything we know right now, is Phil versus Shane. Now, to me, I feel like this is a pretty far-fetched final two because Phil is such a pretty big threat coming into this final 5. I feel like Phil is someone who's going to have to win out from this point, and Shane is someone who, yeah, may have some protection through Marion. However, I feel like it's very unlikely that Shane will be taken along to the end, as he doesn't seem super well positioned outside of that, and plus I could easily see him being picked off if Phil were to win immunity along the way. So through that, I feel like these two getting to the end together is pretty unlikely. Now, if it were to happen, I feel like Phil would probably win. Now, Shane could get some votes here, particularly from Marion, someone who was pretty close to in his original season, and I could possibly see Killarney voting for Shane as well, depending on how negative she feels towards Phil. However, I still feel like this should be a pretty definitive Phil win here, but considering how unlikely I feel like these two are to get to the end together, I feel like I have to lead this scenario here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and again, I feel like this scenario is also pretty unlikely, especially given the two people involved. But here we have Dino versus Phil, and again, I feel like this one is also pretty unlikely, particularly with Phil, again, being in a pretty bad position coming into this final 5, and with Dino seeming to be in not the best position, but also not as bad as someone like a Shane. I do feel like this one is a bit more likely to happen. However, even then, I feel like neither of these people are incentivized to take each other to the end. However, if it were to happen, I think Dino would probably pull up the win. I feel like Dino is someone who has a bit more allies on the jury. I mean, he would have someone like a Tony on there, Meryl, someone he had a good relationship with. I feel like Felix could vote for him as well. And I feel like Phil could also get some votes. I mean, I could see him getting the votes of Killarney, possibly a Shane, someone who doesn't trust Dino too much. However, I still feel like Dino would have the advantage. I feel like Dino could easily portray Phil as someone who made moves a bit more erratically than someone like him. So I feel like Dino would probably pull out the win here, but I feel like this scenario is also pretty unlikely to happen. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we're kind of combining the two scenarios we already talked about. And here we have Dino versus Shane. And to me, this one is a bit more likely as, again, it doesn't involve Phil, who I feel like he would need to win out. However, even then, I don't think it's super duper likely, as Shane is someone who doesn't really trust Dino too much. And I can't see Dino taking Shane to the end over Killarney. I feel like Dino is more likely to cut Shane before the end compared to someone like a Killarney. However, if this scenario were to happen, I feel like Dino would probably win. Now, obviously, Shane could get some votes here, particularly through a Marion. However, I feel like Dino, again, would have the majority of the votes. I feel like he has some pretty solid allies on there. I mean, Tony, Dante, I could easily see him getting the full package on board as well. And I could possibly see him getting Phil's vote as well. Now, again, Killarney is a bit up in the air, and to be honest, I'm not entirely sure where Killarney votes in a lot of these scenarios anyway, so that'll be interesting to see, but I feel like Dino should be the pretty clear-cut winner in this scenario as well. But again, I don't think it's as likely as certain other ones we'll be talking about soon. So because of that, I do have it here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7. And if you had told me at the beginning of the season that this would be the final 5 and that this particular scenario would be low, I would have been a bit surprised. However, I feel like seeing how this game has played out, I feel like it's not as likely as certain other scenarios. But here we have Marion versus Shane. And to me, I feel like the main reason this one is this low is because it really hasn't gotten any setup on the show whatsoever. Where we obviously have seen Shane talking pretty highly of Marion throughout a lot of the season. However, even then, I feel like it's a bit downplayed compared to certain other relationships, and particularly ones that are present in this endgame here. And Marion has talked relatively little about taking Shane to the end as well. And I feel like Marion is incentivized to take other people to the end over Shane. So because of that, I feel like this scenario is pretty unlikely unless something were to completely jump out at the last minute. However, I feel like in this scenario, Marion would be the very clear winner here and possibly winning unanimously. Now, again, I feel like Shane could get some votes here, but considering how highly the jury has talked about Marion up to this point, I could very well see Marion sweeping this jury vote. But again, given how little setup that it's gotten on the show, I would be very surprised if it were to happen at this point, and especially compared to certain other options that these players could take. So because of that, I do have it here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a bit of an interesting scenario to get into here, and sort of my nightmare scenario for how this season would end. But here we have Killarney versus Shane, and what a disappointment this would be if this ended up being the final 2. Now, to be honest, the main reason I have it this high is that I feel like Shane could realistically take Killarney to the end as someone he could easily beat, and considering that Killarney is one of the few people that Shane could win against at the end, I feel like that's something that Shane would probably take up if he was given the opportunity. And I feel like Shane would easily win this jury vote as well. I can't see Killarney getting really any respect, as we've heard multiple people during the season talking about how Killarney seems to not have the best read on the game. She thinks she's in way more control than she actually is. And I feel like if Killarney were to try to present the case that she made all these moves at Final Tribal, I feel like she would easily be dismantled there. So I feel like Shane could definitely benefit from that. And I actually feel like this is probably the only scenario that Shane would win here. And while it is a pretty definitive win, I'm not really sure where Killarney would get any votes really. I still feel like this would be largely a letdown compared to some of the other players we've seen over the course of the season. However, it's the fact that Shane could realistically take Killarney to the end over a lot of other people if he were in that position. That does lead me to put this here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is a pretty weird scenario to talk about, and definitely one that I don't have as great a read on. But here we have Marion versus Phil, and honestly, I'm not too sure how this scenario really comes together. I mean, I feel like it would involve Phil having to win the final 5 and final 4 immunities, and through that Dino would be taken out, and then maybe at the final 3 Marion sticks to her idea of taking the best to the end, or perhaps in a scenario where Marion and Phil are at the final 3 with Dino and Marion takes Phil as the easier beat. And through that, I feel like Marion would again probably win pretty definitively. Now again, Phil could get some votes here. I mean, Dino could consider voting for him. And I actually thought at one point that Felix might also consider voting for Phil as well. But considering we just saw in Felix's jury video about how highly he views Marion's game, I feel like that's a bit less likely to happen now. And I feel like through that, that really harms a lot of Phil's chances here, where I feel like the jury will have a lot of respect for a Marion to the point where Phil will probably have a hard time gaining that respect there. Now, again, I could still see him getting some votes, but I still feel like Marion would probably win at the end of the day. So it's a pretty rocky road for Phil in that road, but I do think it's a bit more likely, as I feel like he would definitely need certain people there in order for Marion to make that choice, or for him to make that choice as well, particularly if he wins final immunity and he doesn't have that great a view of Dino at that point. But I feel like other scenarios are a bit more likely. So because of that, I do have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4. And from this point on, I feel like each of these scenarios are pretty plausible and could very well happen. But at number 4, we probably have the one that's the least likely to happen for me. And here we have Killarney versus Phil. And again, I feel like a lot of this is going to be dependent on whether Phil can get this target office back and whether he can get to the final three with Killarney and then either a Dino or a Marion. I feel like if Phil were to win out from this point, including final immunity, he would easily cut whoever's there and take Killarney to the end and securing the easy win. And I think Phil would win pretty definitively in that scenario. Now, again, I feel like Phil is someone who could struggle in front of a jury, particularly with explaining some of his moves that he made, such as him voting out Shona in the pre-merge, or also him agreeing to vote out Tajin at the final 7. However, I feel like against Killarney, he would easily win there. He would be the one who is probably the more in control of what happened during the game. And considering Phil's track record, I mean, he's already won a couple of immunities, and it's not that far-fetched to see him winning a couple more to get into that position. I feel like Phil could end up in the scenario where he takes Killarney to the end and wins. However, I feel like the top 3 are also more likely to happen and are probably less dependent on an immunity run. So because of that, I do have it here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3. And to be honest, if I was talking purely from a game perspective, this one probably should be a bit lower. However, I feel like based on what we've seen on the TV show, I feel like this one could potentially happen. But here we have Dino versus Marion. Now, we recently saw in the Ponderosa video that people like Tony and other people in the jury don't actually think this is going to happen, where despite Marion talking about wanting to take the best and the strongest players to the end, that when it actually comes down to it, she would cut a Dino and take along an easy win against like a Killarney or a Shane. And I feel like that could still potentially happen. I mean, I feel like Marion is a pretty strong player to where she would consider taking that easy option there. However, on the other hand, I feel like the show has shown Marion talk multiple times about this theme of wanting this season to have a strong winner, and seeing Dino as a pretty capable player, I could see her realistically taking Dino to the end. Now, if it were the other way around, I don't think Dino thinks the same way. I think he would cut Marion in a heartbeat if given the opportunity. But I feel like if Marion were to win final immunity, I could see a world where she takes Dino to the end here. And the crazy part is, I think she could actually win against Dino. Now, obviously, I think Dino would get some votes here. I think he would probably get Tony's vote. I could see him getting like a Dante. I could see him getting a Phil as well. However, I feel like a lot of the other votes would go Marion's way. I mean, she would get Shane's vote, of course. I feel like she would also get the full package in Steffi and Meryl. Well, Meryl's more up in the air. I feel like Meryl could be open to voting for Dino, but I feel like that's up in the air. And I feel like she would also get Felix's and Killarney's vote. I feel like Marion would have quite an advantage coming into this final tribal here. However, I still think Dino will get some votes. And at the end of the day, I feel like this would definitely be one of the more interesting final tribals to watch. Sort of like a Haley versus George from Australian Survivor, Brain versus Braun. However, I feel like the top 2 scenarios are a bit more optimal. And I feel like for the players involved in them, they're probably a bit more optimal in terms of the gameplay. So because of that, I do have to leave this one here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2. And honestly, the top 2 are pretty similar and they're pretty boring to talk about, but I'll just run through them quickly. At number 2, we have Dino versus Killarney. And to me, I feel like this is probably going to happen if Dino wins final immunity, like in Killarney and Marion is there. He cuts Marion, takes Killarney to the end. And I feel like Dino would easily win this jury vote. Now, again, whether he wins unanimously is a bit up in the air. I mean, I could see like a Shane potentially voting for Killarney, but even then, I feel like Shane would recognize that Dino played the better game there. And aside from that, I feel like Dino would easily win here. I feel like Dino recognizes how more likely he is to win in this scenario versus taking like a Marion or depending on who's there, like someone like a Phil, for example. However, I feel like the number 1 scenario is a bit more likely to happen based on the current game position of Dino, as well as other factors. So I do have to leave it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the final 2 I believe is the most likely to happen is Killarney versus Marion. Now, as I alluded to a moment ago, I do think Marion would consider cutting a Dino if she were at the final 3 with him against Killarney. And I feel like there is a chance that she recognizes that while she does talk a lot about wanting a strong player to win this season, that she could very easily interpret that as she herself is a strong player and that she would win in dominating fashion. And on top of that, it just makes more sense from a game perspective to just get the win versus trying to win with honor, as we've seen a number of people attempt and fail to do before. However, I feel like this scenario is pretty plausible and more likely than the Dino Killarney scenario, because I feel like Marion is in a better game position right now than Dino, and someone who is more likely to end up in the final three to begin with than a Dino. And if Marion is able to get to the final three with Killarney and someone other than Dino, I feel like this could be even easier. Like, if she's there with Phil and wins final immunity, she easily cuts Phil and takes Killarney to the end. So I feel like this one has multiple ways in which it could happen. And considering that Marion is more likely to end up in a position to take Killarney to the end than someone like a Dino, I feel like I had to have this one above it. And considering the fact that I feel like Marion is the most likely winner and the number one player in my power rankings from yesterday, I feel like she is the most likely to end up in a position to win in dominating fashion. And needless to say, she wins unanimously in this scenario. I don't see Killarney getting a single vote against Marion in this scenario. So at the end of the day, I feel like with all these factors I just considered, I feel like this is the most logical scenario that can happen, and one that could very reasonably happen based on what we know about the game so far. And the only reason that I feel like it couldn't happen is due to the fact that this is Survivor SA and that anything can happen, really. But given everything that we know right now, I feel like this is the most likely scenario to happen, with Marion taking the win here. So because of that, I do have it here at number 1. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, once the season does end, I do plan to make a review along with a player ranking for Survivor SA, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, Big Brother is happening right now, and we just got quite the twist. So it'll be interesting to break that down, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. So there's a lot of stuff coming your way, and I'm glad to make this content. But for now, that is the video. See ya.